From the massive studios in Raleigh, North Carolina, this is the Cloudcast with Aaron Delp and Brian Gracely, presented by a cloud guru, bringing you the best of cloud computing from around the world.
Good morning, good evening, where you are, and welcome back to the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from the massive studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Brian's not able to make it this week, but we actually have alumni from the show, returning guest Shannon Williams, co-founder of Rancher Labs. How you doing this week, Shannon?
I'm good, Aaron. I'm good. Busy getting a big release out. So it's been a hectic month, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, whatever it's been that we've been battening down the hatches, just firing on all cylinders. But great to talk to you again. Great to be back. I love the Cloudcast.
Well, thank you. Yeah, and we were actually just saying before we hit record, it's slightly weird because we've never recorded remotely. We've always been in person at some of the various shows over the years, so it's good to talk to you again. It's been way too long. I think, if I remember correctly, DockerCon EU 2015 was the last time we spoke to actually Darren Shepherd, and then we spoke to yourself and Shang, OpenStack Summit, Vancouver, if I remember correctly. Wow, that's going back a ways.
Yeah, it is. Wow.
Probably a lot of new listeners since then. So why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and how are you doing and what you got going on these days?
Yeah, thanks. I'm Aaron, it's been now almost 3 years since we started Rancher. For those of you who don't know, Rancher is an open source software company. We build projects around containers to make it easier for people to manage their containerized deployments. Our main project is called Rancher. It's a project that we released the first alpha beta of sort of in early 2015, and then GA'd 1.0 kind of beginning of 2016 last year. So it's been crazy. My role here, I'm one of the founders. I run all of the kind of non-engineering side of the company. So I deal with how we take on the market and build sales and marketing and everything around kind of helping people actually take this technology and put it into production. So a lot of my time is spent really out on the road, working with companies of all sizes as they try to, kind of embrace containers and convert their organization into, being kind of independent of different infrastructure stacks and able to deploy their applications anywhere. So yeah, it's a lot of fun.
And I've often said, you just travel crazy amounts as long as I've known you. And so we used to work together at Citrix prior to all of this, but it seems like you definitely, you are the road warrior in this industry, hardest working man in show business kind of thing, right? And so before we dig into details of Rancher, let's talk a little bit about what do you see as kind of the state of the industry in general, and what are some of the themes and trends you've seen in your travels over the last couple of years?
Yeah, it's I've got 3 kids. So I always think that I'm getting better and traveling less, but the reality is at the end of the year, I'm always realizing, oh man, I still spend a lot of the year out on the road, attending
Sure.
events, but a lot of times just working with companies on their strategy. And it's what's the state right now is really interesting because, we're kind of in the point where Docker's been around for a while now. Obviously, Amazon's been around for even longer. OpenStack's been around for a while, and I always kind of see these things as being waves. You're kind of in the VMware wave if you're old as I am, and you're going back to the early 2000s, and then the cloud computing wave of sort of the 2008, 2010, 2012, and the Docker wave kind of kicked off, around 2014, around the time we were getting going. And as people started to think, okay, how do we run applications consistently wherever we're going to run them and develop better and modular, make everything a little more modular. And I feel like we're kind of still in that wave, but we're getting ready for the next wave, which maybe it'll be the Kubernetes wave. Maybe it's the wave that sort of brings all this and ties it together. So, as I'm out there talking to people, we're still early. There's no question. We're still talking to companies who are looking at containers and they're slightly penetrated. They've got teams, projects, groups, deploying these things. They've got maybe a PaaS project. They've done something with Pivotal or OpenShift. They have some teams that are using Docker and CI. They've got some applications, and they're seeing the benefits. I mean, the reality is this stuff has enormous impact on efficiency and density and the quality, and as people see it, they just kind of keep embracing. And so I feel like we're kind of getting ready for a big year. I feel like 2017 has been a really good year. I mean, we first came to market with product last year, and all of a sudden, the beginning of this year was like we couldn't turn around without people coming to us saying, "Hey, we've got this open source project. We've got Rancher in our company. We're using it in all these places. Can we do a little bit more? Or can we make this more strategic instead of tactical?" And I think, I hope that continues into 2018. It's not surprising. I mean, you look at the momentum of Docker themselves. I mean, it's, if you look at things like Docker Hub, in 2015, there was 100 million pulls. By April of this year, there's something like 12 billion pulls off of Docker Hub. 12 billion containers, and even among Rancher users. I mean, I'm always kind of tracking how much people are pulling our software, just our agents that go on the host. And except this time last year, there had been about 1 million pulls of all of the Rancher agents and things that actually get out on the hosts. And by September of this year, it had grown to 60 million. That kind of growth is awesome. It's exhausting at some level, but it's awesome. And,
sure.
And you're certainly excited about it as it happens.
Well, and so Shannon, tell us a little bit more then because there's lots of things here to kind of unwrap then. So Rancher Labs and Rancher.com is the company. Then there is Rancher, then there's RancherOS, and then there is product versus project. And so tell us a little bit about the various offerings, and then also, if you don't mind, kind of help us a little bit with which problems you're trying to solve with each.
Sure. Yeah. Really, it's a great point. I mean, everything we build here at Rancher, we've open sourced. We just build and open source and engage the community. And our projects, as you mentioned, are really the two big ones most people are kind of aware of or are most heavily used are Rancher and RancherOS. The company Rancher Labs is 80 people, based here in Cupertino. We do, the lion's share of the development on these open source projects. There's lots of people in the community that contribute and help, but we're still doing, most of the heavy lifting on building and developing the project and, working with the adopters of it to help them be successful. Most people use Rancher open source. They use Rancher, they just download it, use it, deploy it, run it for their own needs. Same with RancherOS. They just take it and consume it. We, as a company, Rancher Labs, we pay the bills by offering support and consulting services as people transform. So as they adopt Docker, as they deploy Rancher and Kubernetes and bring all this into their organization, we provide them with a commercial supported version of Rancher. It's the same thing. It's just the version that we test and sort of tell them, okay, run it on this version of RHEL or use this type of an architecture to be stable. And then we sometimes help them with the migration as they start to implement containers. So a lot of it is understanding what they're trying to accomplish and helping them with resources necessary to kind of bring their teams up to speed on how to use all this technology. So that's kind of the commercial side of the company. We sell and provide support for that whole stack too. So our customers, they count on us to provide support, the Rancher software, Kubernetes, our distribution of Kubernetes and Docker as well. So we kind of provide the whole thing for customers.
And really, so let's dig in for a second. What are the common use cases you are seeing with your customers to date? Is it customers using Rancher for existing projects? Are they using Catalog? Are they integrated directly into CI/CD pipelines? A little bit of both? Tell me a little bit about that.
Yeah, so basically, a good way to think of Rancher is Rancher's kind of like the two analogies I hear from customers all the time is some people, if they're coming from more enterprise IT, they always say, Rancher's kind of like vSphere. It's this management layer that deploys my clusters, that manages their upgrades, that connects to my LDAP and gives me visibility and management of all of my clusters. What makes Rancher really cool is it's kind of designed to be a platform. It's not like a single implementation of, say, a Kubernetes cluster, for instance, or a Swarm cluster. It's a platform that as a company you deploy or as a group you deploy, and it sets up and manages lots of clusters, or many clusters as you need. So you'll run a production cluster, a staging cluster. In Rancher, we call these things environments. And so when people choose Rancher, one of the first choices they have is deciding what type of environment they want to use. In 1.0, we really focused on giving people some choice here. We were agnostic. So we had people running Swarm, Docker's orchestration as a cluster type. We had people running Mesos, and we had people running Kubernetes. And then we had our own type of cluster, which was called Cattle, which was built around Docker and Docker Compose, and was really a very simple, easy to consume orchestration. And over time, that Cattle experience was very popular among users. We have enormous adoption. I mean, I think there's, we get people send us back stats, and there's something like 13 or 15,000 clusters out there of hosts, terabytes and terabytes of storage and hundreds of thousands of servers all running on Rancher out there in the world. And, the vast majority of those are open source. They're not our commercial customers. They're just using Rancher. And the vast majority of those are using either Cattle or Kubernetes. So over time, Mesos and Swarm have become less and less popular with our customers, and Kubernetes has continued to grow in popularity. Cattle has always been very popular. It's kind of a very lightweight, easy to use orchestration. And it's in many ways kind of similar to Kubernetes. We developed it around the same time as Kubernetes was getting built back in 2014. And so, as we've started thinking about what the future looks like, we're not sure that there's as much demand for kind of orchestration agnostic technology that we were building maybe 2 years ago when we released the 1.0 of Rancher. And now we're starting to think that Kubernetes really gives us a lot of what we need to build great clusters. So we're looking at 2.0 and thinking about how do we take all of the user experience that people really have loved in Cattle and implement that around Kubernetes and sort of get access to the ecosystem that's continued to grow and around Kubernetes. So we're working right now announcing our 2.0 release. And as we roll out the tech preview and the early versions of this for the next couple months, we're showing kind of this approach that we're really excited about, that it takes our ability to run lots of clusters and to run in anywhere, and brings that in a way that will really we think is going to really show off the power of Kubernetes and allow people to spin up their own Kubernetes clusters, or even just consume Kubernetes clusters that they've purchased as a service from companies like Google and Azure and IBM that host managed Kubernetes services. And hopefully in the future, or even Amazon will offer kind of Kubernetes as a service. And as an organization, you can either run your own Kubernetes, you can take a Kubernetes cluster that's being hosted, and you can effectively manage all of those everywhere with consistent policy with Rancher. And that's what we're working on right now.
And so there's really lots to unpack there. The way I look at it too is the way I've always thought about it, and you tell me if this is kind of a correct analogy of Rancher really specializes in that application provisioning experience, like you said, agnostic, both on-prem and in public clouds. But then I'm also wondering too, tell me a little bit more, okay, the long-term management of application workload, whatever you want to call it. How is something like that handled? And is there any design decisions when you're comparing and contrasting Cattle versus Swarm versus Kubernetes, for instance?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, for a long time, all of these orchestrators were really there were lots of pros and cons for them. Some were maybe more mature, others had kind of more of a simple, easy experience. Others were geared maybe more for web services. But over time, they've all gotten a little more similar. For a while, Kubernetes was very feature rich, and Swarm was still coming along. But by now, most of these orchestration platforms are very good. They have lots of functionality. They're good for lots of different things. But at the same time, this coming from sort of the storage side, there's only so much appetite to integrate. There's only so much energy to be spent integrating with lots of different implementations of, say, orchestration, especially when they're all open source, they're all freely available. There's just a natural consolidation that sort of needs to happen as the market matures. And so a lot of what we're looking at right now is, how do we make sure that as people, that are Rancher users and deploy on things, how do we make sure they have access to all the best integrations, everything that's going on? It really led us to kind of look at, okay, Cattle's really popular. It's by far the most popular type of deployment we have within Rancher. How can we keep what makes Cattle really popular, kind of the way it implements, like, for instance, we've always supported very Docker-centric language. So you could use Docker run commands against your cluster and use Docker compose and really be very easy for anyone who understands Docker to consume Cattle. And we looked and said, well, can we bring that type of experience to Kubernetes so that everything that ever worked on Cattle would work equally well on Kubernetes? And I have to say, Darren and the engineering team did an amazing job of kind of looking at these things and thinking, 1.x of Rancher was effectively Cattle based on top of Docker for most users. In 2.x, we wanted to give them this really great experience, but base it all around Kubernetes so that, all that storage technology, networking, monitoring, all the integrations people can do to Kubernetes and its awesome API will be available to all of our customers and would be just native. And that we could also stop developing a lot of things that were overlapping with what Kubernetes was building on and could focus our energies in other areas of innovation. So that really kind of drove our thinking and what we wanted to do with 2.0. And I'm really excited about it because, for the one thing, I think a lot of people who are Kubernetes users will find that the ability to take their existing cluster and deploy, connect it to Rancher will give them amazing visibility and, really cool ways to manage their applications. And that application lifecycle management that Rancher's always been really well regarded around will be really valuable if you're a Kubernetes user. And if you're an existing Rancher Cattle user, you really can do everything you're doing the same, but be confident that everything's going to be running against Kubernetes, which is more and more becoming the industry standard, we feel, for container orchestration. And so this is really trying to give our users everything that's going on in the ecosystem while building more innovation around Kubernetes and solving other problems like logging and monitoring and making it easier to work with different CI tools. So all those things we can tackle, which otherwise we would have to spend a lot of resources, doing similar work to what was going on in the Kubernetes community. So We've always been big believers in grabbing and taking and consuming and participating in open source projects, and I think we're continuing down that road.
And this feels to me a bit like a way back in our kind of Cloud Stack and OpenStack days of, if you think of those as the abstraction layer to the underlying hypervisor and the resources, this feels to me like an abstraction layer, at the time, because we weren't exactly sure, because we had some uncertainty in the market of Docker, Kubernetes, and Mesos and all these others. We needed that abstraction layer to have a common interface and a common operations, but then over time, like you were saying, as I wouldn't say a Victor shows, because I think that's going way too far, but as a maybe more dominant operations model, in this instance Kubernetes, starts to form, then you have less of a need to do that and you can focus on the higher level work. Now, what I did want to point out, though, too, because I just thought it was really good on your website, is folks should check out, there's a white paper actually on comparing orchestrators that y'all have done. I took a look the other night and it's really well done. And, I'm saying it's, it's down in the weeds, but I'm saying that in a very nice complimentary way. So that'll be in the show notes as well. So, some really interesting things to design decisions at the end of the day. And that really rolls into Rancher 2.0. There are some really good things in there. And so let's talk about what just released.
Yeah, so Rancher 2.0 is, we announced it on Tuesday the 26th, and really the whole idea of 2.0 is to make it just incredibly easy for organizations to adopt containers, and by doing that, use Docker, Kubernetes, all of the underpinning technology necessary, but really focus on the user experience. And so what we've done with 2.0, the tech preview that we released today is sort of the first step in releasing this product. And what we've implemented is what I think of as sort of two main layers of kind of technology. One is what we call kind of our multi-cluster management. So we've built this amazing federation for managing lots of clusters, lots of Kubernetes clusters and Docker clusters, meaning, whether you just have hosts and you want to build a Kubernetes cluster out of them, or you already have a Kubernetes cluster, you can take and attach those very easily with a single command into your Rancher environment. And Rancher will then build up and deploy a Kubernetes environment for you, or begin managing your existing Kubernetes cluster from GKE or Azure, and provide a lot of value on top of that, from sort of the lifecycle management of the Kubernetes, upgrading it, health checks to make sure it's available, to sort of integrated RBAC connections to your AD, LDAP, to monitoring for the health, backup of your cluster and your etcd to make sure they can be recovered. So we've built this whole layer that we think of as kind of operational multi-cluster management for the containers and for your Kubernetes clusters. That is cool, because what it means is, as a user, you get Kubernetes everywhere, and it's already kind of happened. You can already get Kubernetes now from a number of cloud providers. Now you can either deploy your own Kubernetes with a single click using Rancher's distribution of Kubernetes, or you can bring your own cluster. The other big piece on top of sort of the deployment, management, lifecycle, and provisioning of this is a full user experience built around that, meaning visibility and management of all of these containerized applications, all of your applications. We've implemented a full app catalog that supports both Docker Compose environments and Kubernetes Helm deployments. The ability to talk either natively directly to Kubernetes API or kube control, or to talk through through traditional Rancher's API to Cattle API using Docker run commands. We made it really easy for team users, whether they really know Kubernetes or they're just familiar with Docker, to come in and start provisioning, deploying, and running their services. And as always, we implement a lot of infrastructure services like DNS and networking and load balancing and storage management to, just make this whole thing very, very simple. So that's really what we're implementing, what we're doing with 2.0, and we expect that it'll help companies from both the side of provisioning and managing lots of different clusters across their organization, across different teams, to making the onboarding of containers and Kubernetes in an organization much easier. So it's exciting. We think it's a big release. It'll probably take us another couple months to go through the beta process of releasing this is a tech preview we released this week, and then we'll be releasing, every 2 or 3 weeks, we'll be releasing, more functionality and features into it as we get closer to GA, sometimes toward the end of the year, early next year.
Oh, good to hear, Shannon. Let me ask you another thing, though, that popped up while we were talking about that. So a big feature here has been kind of, think of it as multiple orchestrators under the covers, or multiple schedulers under the covers. But how often are folks really using this for multi-site of, you're running a certain amount of clusters on-prem or a certain amount of clusters in AWS or GCP, and how often are folks using Rancher in a multi-site scenario, and why would they do something like that?
Yeah, it's incredibly common. I would say it's one of the most common use cases is sort of this hybrid cloud deployment model. We see it now. It's not always the same team. There's a lot of our larger users out there that are they're big IT shops with tens of thousands of developers, and in many cases they have many infrastructure platforms. And so what they'll one customer talks about running 60 plus applications in Rancher across Amazon, GKE, and OpenStack, and VMware. So, users can provision clusters wherever they need them. They can deploy them to those clusters and, very easily mount a cluster from a different provider, or run their own cluster in a provider, and control who can access it. So, if you think of almost like, in many ways, it really is almost like a cloud, in that it's this sort of container cloud that you're running for your organization, where you get Kubernetes as a service, you get cluster management, cluster lifecycle management, and then obviously application management and application level monitoring and visibility and logging and CI integration and all these kind of pieces. So yeah, multi-cloud is a big part of it. It's been a big part from the beginning, and we see it over and over again. The USDA has talked a lot about how they use OpenStack for all their development with Rancher, and they then push to production on VMware. And I think that's not an unusual setup. I mean, we see the same thing from even local machines. People run local labs, things like that, for maybe a dev cluster, and then they'll push to staging and production running on Amazon or on VMware or somewhere else. So we see broad array. Other companies are using this stuff to leverage, things like spot instances to cut down on their bills. I mean, a lot of the deployments are about, kind of getting access to big data and building pipelines around big data, or creating catalogs for developers to pull down, common pieces of code. I mean, there's lots of different use cases, but they all kind of fall back on the same thing, Aaron. It's like people just want to, have this modularity of deployment and management that containers do so well. But you do need some management around there. Just the complexity is high. Just running a Kubernetes cluster requires some expertise. Those are things that Rancher just kind of takes away for you. It makes it really easy. And because it's open source software, you can take this, deploy it. There's also dozens of companies who rolled out managed Rancher services, literally dozens and dozens of them across the world. So you can either run it yourself, or you can find someone who's hosting it for companies to make it easy to manage and deploy their clusters.
That sounds great. Sounds great. Now, Shannon, we're kind of running out of time here. So where can everyone find out more about you? Where in the world is Shannon at any given time? Reach out to the Rancher folks. What's the best way to really get more information?
Well, I'm on Twitter. That's probably the best. I'm always chatting on Twitter with people. So you can find me on Twitter at SMW355. The company is at rancher.com. We have a great Slack community with thousands of people there. If you want to join and chat with us, if you're trying things, you can always email me at shannon@rancher.com if you just want to chat and ask a question. I'm always happy to talk. And then obviously all the source code is up on GitHub. You just go to GitHub Rancher Labs and you can find it all there. Or take a look at the docs for getting started guides on how to set up your own Rancher deployment. The 2.0 is, like I said, it's a tech preview, so it's also up on GitHub. You can pull it down and start playing with it and try it out whenever you like.
Fantastic. Well, Shannon, thank you very much for your time this week, and for Brian, who wasn't able to make it this week. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening, and we'll talk to everyone next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to the Cloudcast. Please visit thecloudcast.net to find more podcasts, show notes, and everything social media. And visit acloud.guru for all your cloud training needs.